Hello, it's Joanna Lumley here. And before we start this podcast, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about the Actors Benevolent Fund, which is here to support actors and stage managers in times of illness, injury, old age, and financial hardship. This industry can be wonderful, but it can also be challenging. And the ABF is here to help by offering grants in times of need and by providing a sense of community. If you're in the position to help support others in our industry, or if you need support yourself, you can find details of how to contact the ABF, as well as ways of keeping up to date with developments via social media, in the show notes of this episode. Meanwhile, why not become a member, which you can do through the ABF website. Thank you so much.
Hello and welcome to the ABF Podcast, where each week we invite special guests to talk to us about challenges they faced in the theatre and TV industry, from dealing with performance anxiety to rejection to coping with ageing and questions around our identity. Sat alongside them each week, we have coaches and therapists to help unpack the subject and offer practical advice. My name is Hannah Whittingham and I will be your host. In today's episode, we're talking about coping with rejection, which is such a big part of the industry. And for this, we're joined by actor Omari Douglas and wellbeing coordinator and coach Lisa Marie Hall. Omari Douglas is probably best known for playing Roscoe Babatunde in It's a Sin, but his career has spanned the stage, musicals and the screen, and he's been nominated for multiple awards. He is currently just finished starring in A Little Life in the West End. Lisa Marie Hall worked as a top designer in UK film and TV for 25 years, alongside teaching at universities. After reaching burnout, she trained as a workplace sleep ambassador with the UK Sleep Charity and became a trained wellbeing coordinator and mental health first aider with a focus on diversity and inclusion. She now works as a personal development coach and mentor, through which she offers support to crew talent of all ages and experiences. So, Omari, I'm going to start with you.
Cool.
Just in terms of, there is so much rejection in this industry on both sides of the camera slash stage, actually. But I suppose the big one that comes to mind straight away is auditions and jobs. How is your audition game mentally? Do you find them easy? How has your experience been?
Such a good question. I think my relationship with auditions changes all the time.
Okay.
In the sense that I think when I first left drama school, I was on a musical theatre degree at UTZ, and I do feel that there was this sense of just kind of wanting to work and just wanting to be in the industry and just sort of wanting to get experience and just be on stage. And so I think at that time, I felt like I was auditioning all the time. And so I felt like that I was getting this balance of kind of like getting lots of rejection, but then just sort of like not really having that much time to dwell on it because you were just kind of jumping back into another audition. Yeah. But I do remember certain auditions where I had kind of put a lot on it, or sort of like put a lot of expectation in there, or sort of really wanted the job. And I guess, of course, like any project that you sort of feel particularly passionate about, like it does hurt more when you get that rejection. But I think what I have now started to, or at least what I'm trying to like experiment with in my life, me and my boyfriend talk about this quite a lot, is like just trying to sort of like be present in sort of everything else that's going on like outside of that world, so that you can actually go into that space when you then audition sort of feeling quite sort of not breezy, but just sort of feeling quite calm, because you feel like that you're not sort of like loading loads of expectation into it. And I think it can just make that process kind of not easier, but I think it makes you feel like that there is less to lose by like not having loaded like all of that expectation when going into an audition. But yeah, it I feel like it changes all the time. And I think that, you know, only comes from sort of like having the sort of the, well, I guess still relatively sort of like minor years of experience, but I left drama school in 2015.
Right.
And so in that space of time, like, I feel like that I've sort of developed my own, I don't know, sort of like coping mechanisms or just like way of sort of like being able to deal with those kind of things. But there's certain, I remember in particular, like when I was auditioning for It to Sin, and that was the first, so I mean, I'd done a few kind of like screen auditions at that point, but not many. I felt like I didn't really know what I was doing. It was my first time I'd done a television, or like maybe my second or third time going in to do a television audition, where I was going in and meeting the team, like in a room. And I remember like doing the first audition and just putting the sides in the bin when I left, because I was just like, I have done what I think I have done, and whatever they're going to think of it is what is out of my control. And I think that's what I'm just trying to learn now, to just relinquish control and just go, I'm going to go in and do me. And if it's right for them, it's right. And if not, it's not, you know, so.
And that's actually, it's quite interesting you mentioned that and what you've been doing before, because you did so much theatre before doing television. And I'm interested about whether you find the difference in the way that different things are auditioned, the process. Like musical theatre is usually particularly brutal. And then you've got sort of straight theatre that's sort of somewhere in the middle. And then television is often a little bit less formal somehow, and oddly. I'm wondering how you find those different, the different ways of auditioning, and whether there are some of them that are easier to cope with not getting, or it not necessarily going well than others because of the process.
There is, it feels like, I mean, gosh, it feels like such a long time, but like, I remember when I first left drama school, and it was like, you're going into dance calls where you're literally stood in the room, and when they finish the dance call, they will come with a sheet and say, you're staying, you're staying, you're staying.
I actually feel quite ill when you're talking about it.
I know, it's so mad. And it's mad because it kind of like, I feel like that element of it almost like fits into the kind of like cliche of like what people think is the kind of like cutthroat mentality of the industry. I think maybe it affects you more than you do actually realise, like being in that environment, because I feel like I just accepted it as just part and parcel of like what the job is. But I think to go away and actually think about what that means, or like what that does to you, to be stood in a room and just constantly be told like, you're staying, you're not staying in front of a group of people. It's tough.
There's
really
no way
tough.
of making it nice as well, no matter how much they preface it with, thank you all so much for coming. And obviously the selection is based on this, this and this, not on whether you're good or not, but they're still calling out your name or not. And then if you're not called, you have to leave and everyone sees you go. It's just...
But it's like, it's quite like for yourself, if you're that person that then has to leave the room, it's quite funny because it's like, you're really sweaty, like you've got loads of clothes, like often like I'm still this person now, I always have like more bags than I actually need, and you take ages like trying to like tidy your bags, and then you realise that everyone's waiting for you to leave, and you're just kind of like got clothes strewn over your shoulder, and you're dragging bags, and you're like walking out of a room in really loud tap shoes. Just like so awkward. Going back to what you were saying about sort of the comparison between that and then like TV and or plays or something, you get a lot of those phrases that are kind of communicated to you, like an agent will say, you're in the mix. And so you just spend, I think a lot of what I feel like we all spend our time doing as actors and creatives is just being in limbo. I remember auditioning for ensemble tracks in like West End shows, and there's one West End show that I auditioned for, and it was like, I think my agent said that I'd done 11 rounds for it. And very often you go in and you do exactly the same thing that you've done before to exactly the same panel of people. Which is, I think there's an element of subservience, I think, that you have to be willing to kind of let yourself fall into, which I don't agree with, actually. I think it's one of the things that it could be, that I just think is just not great about the industry. Sort of making people, because, you know, we're all constantly trying to make ends meet.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're constantly juggling like other jobs to be able to get to an audition.
Yeah.
It's like, you're making me come back 5 times to do exactly the same thing.
No, I agree. And just before we bring Lisa in, actually, have you got to the point where you don't take it personally when you're not given the job? Or are there instances where that's easier to do than others?
I think, do you know what? It's weird because I think often when you're going in and meeting people, I think that's when it's easier to not take it personally, or I think it's when it's easier to attach yourself to something more. Because in the last, how many years, 4 or 5 years, like everything's become more, you put something on a tape.
Yeah, yeah.
I feel quite disconnected from it now.
Yeah.
Because you do a tape and then it just goes out into an ether somewhere.
Yeah.
And you don't actually know how many people are even auditioning for that job.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's hard to actually have any connect in that sense.
I wonder, that's interesting though, about how much of the feeling of rejection is tied into seeing the people that are in competition with you.
Well, yeah, because I think very often we like compare ourselves to people. And I think that in itself, it ties itself into rejection, because it's like the rejection is it because I'm not like that?
Yeah. Lisa, I want to bring you in at this point, because obviously you've worked with a lot of people in a coaching capacity around this, and you've worked in the industry sort of on the other side quite a lot as well. What is going on that makes rejection so hard to deal with in this context?
So I actually think you've already kind of explained it quite well, your own coping mechanism. And I'm sort of going to give you a bit more of a sort of psychological framework as to what is going on there. I sort of subscribe to this concept of self-advocacy speaking, which is a bit rooted in non-violent communication. And so rejection, we often think, is a feeling. Okay, I feel rejected.
Yeah.
Rejection is not a feeling at all. It's not a human emotion. It is how we interpret other people's behaviours. It's what we'd class as a thought.
Yeah.
So rejection often kind of gets a bit messy for us as humans in a modern society, particularly in the creative sector. So the idea is that when we kind of confuse our feelings for thoughts, which rejection is, we then sort of start looking at how can we remedy this feeling of rejection that we may have inside, this thought that we're having. How does it manifest? And it often kind of goes to a place of suffering, shame, self-doubt, crippling confidence, and it starts to like kind of cause a chain reaction of other emotions. And that's often how people kind of get into a cycle of worrying what people might think about them, worrying about whether they will work again. And I'm speaking for everyone here. You know, I've worked behind the scenes and getting jobs, and it's just as difficult. So I don't have a first-hand experience of being an actor with auditioning, but it is very similar. You are putting your creative self out there to be judged.
Yeah.
So the way I sort of coach and work it, we sort of go in four stages. The first stage is to kind of really observe what's going on.
Yeah.
And we're all pretty terrible at doing that, myself included. We often attach a lot of judgment and criticism and thoughts behind what we think is going on.
Yeah.
So people, they don't want to hire me. They're not going to cast me. I'm not right for them. I'm not good enough. And so we start thinking that that's what's going on.
Yeah.
As opposed to observing,
Yeah.
you were not chosen today. That is a straight observation. So firstly, we kind of needs to sort of pick apart what is honestly going on in front of you. As you were saying, what is honestly going in front, as opposed to all the thoughts and judgments and criticisms towards yourself and others you may be attaching to it.
Yeah.
Then you move into the second phase, which is identifying your feelings. Now, again, this is where we tend to go horribly wrong. We jump to thoughts quite quickly. So rejection, for example, is a thought. So I didn't get cast, so I now feel rejected.
Yeah.
And all of these are just sort of judgments that lead to other thoughts. And they're not actually truthful, but it can cause a spiral for many people that you'll start building your behaviours and your responses based on that assumption that you've just made.
Yeah.
And so my job is to help people teach them how to observe more and then to understand their feelings. So if you were thinking that you're rejected, actually what is hidden underneath that is perhaps feelings of sadness, loneliness, isolation. Could be anger, it could be disappointment, but these are all genuine human emotions that will probably manifest in in a physiological way in your body. You know, your heart rate might change, you might get sweaty, you might feel a bit sick in your stomach, you might, for some people, hard to swallow, want to shut down using your mouth, not want to talk. So those feelings are important to identify rather than attaching itself to the word rejection. And then you move on to the important bit, which is your needs. And that's, I suppose, the crux of my input in today's session. If you have experienced a thought of rejection, one has to ask, what is the need not being met? Now, all your emotions and feelings as a human being are little signals to say a need of yours is not being met, or it is being met. So if you feel happy, it's probably because a deep need of yours is being met. And what needs are, they're very universal for all humans. And the slight problem with needs is that we do the same thing we did with the other two stages. We jump to strategy rather than a need. So I need to get that job in order to feel okay. For example, I need to be cast in that part. I need to nail this audition. They're not actual human needs at all. They're just a strategy. And so a strategy is just an action. It doesn't actually satisfy something deep inside of you. And so I work with people to kind of identify needs. So if we go through not getting a part and feeling an overwhelming sense of rejection, that may be needs signaling you may not feel that you have autonomy in your career. You, as you were talking about connection, you may feel that you want to be part and accepted by a group or a community of people. You may feel like you are not getting enough progress in your life. And progress is a really integral human need. And so is stability, security, and safety. These are fundamental human needs that I think most of us in a modern society. And so these needs could actually be trying to tell us something. Yeah. And so a lot of people, and myself included, used to feel rejected by not getting jobs. And an emotional sort of self-doubt and lacking of confidence because of that. But I had attached my need for financial security to getting a job, or my need for validation and acceptance. So I had mixed the two up. And in doing that sort of strategy, if I get a job, then I'll feel financially secure. You're going to go so far with that until it sort of falls apart. And the fourth stage of the self-advocacy speaking is how to request your needs. That's a bigger conversation, but it's learning that rejection is normally, if you're feeling it in an honest way, is a sign that one of your needs is not being met. So either your career is not satisfying you in some way, i.e. you're not connecting, you're not progressing, you don't have autonomy, or actually this is more to do like, I don't feel like I belong. And so to start looking, as you quite rightly did, about being present in the rest of parts of your life, that's about learning to satisfy those base needs we all have, but not putting it all into the job. And that might be to do with your family, your chosen family, your support network. That might be to do with other things you have in your life. That might be to do with your health and your body, and other aspects where you need to look at those needs being met. That is sort of how we start picking apart the overall concept of rejection. So that's sort of from a base sort of psychological point of view that underpins, as you were saying, your desire to sort of be present and then care less in a way when you go into that space. And that's basically the psychology that's kind of going on underneath that.
I feel like it changes all the time.
Yeah, and I think all our human needs continuously change, and they change as we were kids into adults and going through navigating adult life and into getting older as well. And it's constant practice. You know, we call this a sort of it's always work in progress. It is a life's work where the aim really is just to become so aware of you even cycling through those needs. Like if you can get that far, you're onto a winner. It's not about just satisfying your needs all the time and that therefore they're satisfied and it'll be done. It's very much becoming aware that as you go through the peaks and the troughs of life, that you will need to keep adjusting accordingly and balance your sort of response and go, is this a thought or is this a feeling? Is this a need or is this a strategy? And learning to pick apart the two, and just that level of awareness. And then the real flip side of self-advocacy speaking is if you can be aware of that in yourself, then you start to try and translate that to everyone else around you, that everyone else is going through that. So when people behave in a certain way towards you, try and think it the other way. What's their need not being met for them to say that to you?
Yeah.
And that constant dialogue, and that's harder to do, but once you've made it good practice for yourself, it's a bit easier.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense to me, actually. I've been seeing a therapist for years, and the sort of therapy he tends to do is based around parts therapy. The idea with that is that a part of you will hijack you, and that part obviously really is a part that's responding to a need not being met. So it's sort of the same thing. And the idea is that you become more and more aware that you've been hijacked by, that child who
it's always your inner child. It's always your inner child.
Or the teenager.
Hijack
That's usually
is such a good word.
Yeah, I know, isn't it? It's great.
Like, it makes sense in that context so much.
But also... and this sort of maybe works against the word hijack slightly, but also to recognize that all of those parts are defense mechanisms, and actually they're not bad. There are no bad parts. They're all there for a reason, and it's all about awareness. And in the system that you're talking about, it's okay, which need is it that is causing this reaction in me?
And I like the need part because actually it's very concrete, tangible. I think I have a lot of neurodivergent clients.
Yes.
And we find this method works really well because actually it's not too abstract.
Yes.
Talking about feelings can be abstract. And I also need to bring and highlight the fact that there is such a thing called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, RSD, which is anyone can suffer from. And at various points in their life, it has a higher prevalence with neurodivergence than it does with neurotypical. But it is a genuine neurological way that your brain is operating, where rejection becomes incredibly painful and difficult to deal with, and you cannot regulate your emotions when dealing with rejection. And so that is a genuine thing out there. And I think if anybody has a neurodivergence or knows or is close to people, please read about it. It is a genuine thing, and people perhaps should be a little bit more aware that when you are dealing with somebody, that people will feel rejection deeply, neurologically. It's not something that they can just think away or think differently. That is going to be part of how they are. And so they have how to care and manage for that. And whether you're a support network or you're an agent or a casting director or, you're a producer in the room, to just be aware of how you may frame stuff, as you were saying, those phrases issued to you, or maybe a chance to just have a think about how some people in that room might take that. And that's not simply don't take it personally. There'll be a sector of the neurodivergent creative community where that will be very hard to do.
Gosh, I can imagine how, I guess in any formative period in your life, how all that stuff must store. I feel like still right now I'm trying to unlearn all of the things that you get told when you're in training that does build up. I remember that stuff, the stuff that does make you feel not good enough. In those environments, the things that you get picked apart for, when you're in that space. And very often, as you said, there can be quite often the things that are going to allow you to flourish. To have your sensitivity picked apart is insane, because it's surely your sensitivity is what is going to make you a good and present and aware actor, dancer, artist, whatever. And I had a pastoral care officer at my secondary school who was an ex-police officer. And he used to tell me all the time to stop being to stop being so sensitive. And that it's insane to me now. It's something that I've spoken to my therapist a lot. We come back to that quite a lot.
And then when you meet rejection, then it's very hard for you to not to go, well, that bit of my identity must be the reason why. And I think that's a very human, logical way to think, if your body has been conditioned and programmed that. And it does take therapy, and I think coaching, and it is trying to realize those messages that seemed so innocuous, I suppose, at a certain point, have just kind of made some neural pathways in your brain that as you get older, and sometimes it doesn't present until you actually get more experienced in your career. Sometimes a little bit of age helps you pinpoint that something's not quite right.
Yeah, but I think it's really interesting. Giles Terrera is on one of these other podcasts as well, and he was saying it was the episode was on identity, and he was saying that he really feels very strongly that an actor's superpower is their sensitivity, because that's what makes you able to empathize with other people, other characters, really people watch, understand how things work, and that's something you need to treasure and nurture, actually. So with that in mind, it's sort of extraordinary that then it ends up becoming painted as a negative.
Yeah.
And in drama school particularly, I think there's a really difficult balance between criticism of you technically as an actor and elements of you that are you as a person.
Oh, that happened a lot. Like, as in that what you said about sort of that line crossing over into that line of stuff that comes into personal identity territory.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk recently, you know, about, you know, sort of the culture of teaching in drama schools.
Yeah.
You know, my training was part of a very sort of like focused like investigation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, quite recently. And yeah, there is this line that is so, and a part of me understands like why it is maybe easy to cross that line, because I guess as an artist you're using yourself to do all of this stuff, and so there is the technical stuff, but also there is the stuff that is obviously going to cross the line into, you know, the things that are you. And you know, very often there was a lot, one of the things that I think was that I think about a lot is the kind of the vocabulary and the approach, or just the attitude towards kind of I think queerness, like queer identity, like in those spaces, because, you know, very often by teachers you were told, basically you were kind of chastised for basically not being masculine enough. Right. And that, again, I'm trying to unlearn the sort of the how that blocks you. Because when I left school, I didn't understand how I was, or at least I didn't know for a long time that I wasn't able to sort of self-express like in the way that I should have been, because you're just led to believe that that you need to adhere to whatever this kind of faux idea of sort of masculinity is to be a sort of believable person on stage. I remember we used to get told in a quite a jovial way, but even still, no pecs, no jobs.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. Which I guess in a certain bracket of the industry is true, but it's also not, it's not concurrent with like the broader sense of just like what being an actor is. It's taken me a long time to learn that, like, about authenticity. And I moved to London when I was 18, and I felt like I'd only even sort of very messily come out to my friends at that point at home. And so I moved to London and I was still figuring out who I was. You're going into this space where there's not even that many people who look like you. There's not really many people who you can connect with. And I think this is where like intersectionality starts to come into play.
There's a lot of stuff intersecting there for you.
Yeah, totally. Like there were other queer people there. There weren't many black queer people. I didn't really meet any other kind of like many other queer people of colour until I actually went into the industry, started doing more jobs with people, starting to be able to validate my own experience. Yeah. And I do think that a lot of that does affect training, because the way that you're viewed through the lens of the educators, the people who are giving you that training, they put that perspective onto you and how they view that you will be perceived in the industry, and the work that they think you will do. You know, oh, you're this person, so therefore you're going to do this.
Yeah.
And so there has been this sense kind of for me, especially kind of going like a feeling really sort of happy that I've sort of been able to kind of like exceed some of those expectations that I feel like that people had put on me.
Yeah.
But it is really like deeply affecting those things that get said to you in those early days.
And I'm interested in how that then sort of carries through. So to moving on beyond auditions to just when you're doing jobs, it can feel, whether it's in a rehearsal room where, you know, you're asked to be brave and make bold choices, and or whether it's on set where you've got your 3 takes and that's basically it. That can feel like a little loads of mini rejections through the day. If you do a brave choice, everyone goes, okay. Or there's just, you know, silence after it happens. How have you dealt with that as you've gone through?
Yeah, there's been loads of, I feel like I've had a lot of scenarios where it's really hard not for all of that kind of background stuff that you know, stuff that you've built up, stuff that you've stored to not come into play. I think very often what insecurities can do to you is very often it's like, how am I coming across in this moment? Very often, like when at drama school, when they're kind of like pointing at you and sort of picking things apart, it's like, well, now it's actually much harder for me to actually take that lens off of myself in order to be present with this work. As far as just trying to be braver goes, I think it's been addressing that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think addressing that stuff with an acting coach has been so amazing, because I think you just sort of think, oh, you leave school and you're just sort of out there on your own and you just deal with the skill set that you now have. But actually you have to keep developing it. And I guess, as I've said, I think with all this stuff that gets stored up from drama school, you don't realise all the time that it is affecting the work.
Yeah. And I guess this question to both of you, I'm going to start with you, Lisa. Do you think, and you've sort of touched on it already, there are things that could change in the way the rehearsal room environment is set up, or as you've mentioned before with auditions, sort of the way that the language that is coming back, or whether it's on set as well? What would make it feel less rejecting, do you think?
Oh, it's a tricky one, because I think it's like trying to turn an oil tanker sometimes.
Yeah.
And sadly, we're not a speedboat. But I think it's twofold. One is a level of awareness that we can all have, and that's a self-advocacy. In order to create that as a grassroots, that's a community effort in that shouldn't just be the onus on every individual. And being freelance, that makes it very hard to find that cohesion. I do still think there's a stigma that you were all supposed to just, muscle on. To be able
it's
to,
all. This is what it's all about.
I've been told on the biggest jobs that I've done, just got to tough it out and be tough and soldier on and don't take it personally and don't be sensitive. I think we need to maybe break that stigma. Yeah, and I think that's a collective conversation, whether that's in companies or in teams, behind the scenes or in front of the camera. But I also think there needs to be better safeguarding, and there's something about having a voice, and I've watched this through my wife, who works with lots of actors doing self-tapes and various bits. Just the lack of autonomy that you have in some ways to be able to choose the material that goes forth, but as you say, it's so disconnected. And for me as an outsider looking in on your audition process and casting processes, it seems to be so impersonal and fast and furious. Yeah. I don't know whether being in the room more and having more open conversations would help, but I also can just see that there's an awful lot of people making decisions about who they want to cast. They have no idea what they want until it walks through the door. Yeah. And that is the same as being a designer in film and TV. You have directors and producers that don't know what they want. Yeah. And you are constantly trying to give everything, second guessing and trying to read people's minds. I do think it's our industry has become a space where people are terrified to make a decision, so they don't. Yeah. And so we're all kind of left trying to offer continuously. I think that opens up a potential for lots of rejection. I've worked with many directors that just hate making decisions. I'm like, that is your job.
Yeah.
but we all then feel like we're not quite getting it right. And I think there's got to be something perhaps about supporting, training the key decision makers so that briefs are really clear, casting briefs are really clear, and maybe that can then make a better communication and connection with who is being auditioned, so there can be better dialogue rather than it's a sort of factory like get out. We'll find it when we see it.
Yeah, and I want to sort of finish up talking a little bit about reviews, dear God, and the sort of the social media review as well. But just before we do, I'm curious, Omari, have you had an experience, whether it's in a show or whether it's on a set, where it has felt particularly comfortable and you have felt sort of particularly safe? And can you put your finger on anything that was different about that environment that made it feel that much more comfortable?
Oh, yeah. I mean, even just recently, I just finished A Little Life and we were supported by a mental health organisation called Applause for Thought, which is run by one of my really close friends, Raffaella Covino.
Right.
She set that company up in, oh gosh, I don't want to get this wrong. It's maybe 2018, 2019 maybe. And they were approached by Wessex Grove, our producers, to come on board and create a bespoke programme for like company-wide, like across the company, which meant that they were setting up programmes for the front of house teams. We worked in 3 different theatres, like whilst over the course of this production. They were supporting stage management, the creative team. There was an audience programme as well, and obviously they were supporting the actors. We worked with a psychotherapist, Victoria Abbott, who works for Applause for Thought, and she's so fantastic. She supported us all the way through the process. There's like a post-show programme as well for us. And I think that in itself has been just invaluable. Yeah. Like, invaluable. I mean, you know, subject matter aside, you know that show is particularly heavy and sort of covers so much, huge subject matter. I think as actors, every time we step into a new space, we are so vulnerable. And I also think, I don't know whether it's just the sort of my confidence in myself in allowing me to do this, but I think knowing that was in place, I feel like I was having more vulnerable conversations with my company than I maybe possibly would have had like in other companies. Just trying to be more honesty about my kind of just the sort of just the vulnerability that is expected of you in these processes. You know, working with new directors and just sort of the openness that you have to have for that, which is so, you know, it's so scary every time you just sort of step into this new territory. And so as well as there being this kind of like structural support, which was so evident and like well maintained for all of us throughout that process, I felt more kind of inclined to sort of just try and be more vulnerable with the people around me and just be more honest. And because especially when you're doing a show for such a long time, you know, it's really difficult, you know, mentally and physically and emotionally. And so I'm glad that I felt kind of like compelled to have more of those conversations with people, because more often than not, people share those feelings with you. And I think it's so easy to feel that you are lonely in those feelings that you have when you're going through a big process, when you're just sort of like having to put your creative self on the line for people. I just think more of that. And I think, you know, I mean, Applause for Thought are a brilliant organisation. They've been working with numerous productions, and I've seen, I feel like I go and watch stuff now, and more often than not, I'll like look in the programme and it will say that there's a drama therapist working on the show, and I feel like it's more common. But of course, that becomes like I guess it becomes like a fiscal and a structural thing. It's like, do all of our organisations like have the money to be able to sort of support that? And another thing that I will say particularly about that production is with A Little Life is that I do think, you know, Wessex Grove, I they're very just, I think they're very transparent in the way that they work as producers. I think very often the line between the producers and the actors can feel quite distant. They're very present, like in those processes. I think a lot of the main producers were on during that process, and so it makes such a difference to sort of how you feel in that process when the producers are present, and that you have a direct line of communication with them,
have a voice, like Lisa was saying earlier. I think that's really interesting. Transparency, presence and support. That's it. That's what, and you're right, there's, you know, I think probably the reason that you then perhaps felt more able to be more open or more vulnerable with the other actors is that you had a support process already in place, which meant that it was easier for you all to do that with one another. And it's about working out how even really small local theatres could be able to do the same thing. You don't have all of that funding and just build it in. I was just thinking about what Lisa was saying as well, like that thing of walking into an audition room as well. I don't think that we're ever really, and it is hard to, I think it's ever a hard thing to kind of quantify or like teach, but very often like you walk into an audition room feeling like the less powerful person. I think there's a panel of people like sitting in front of you, and I think it's so hard to break that dynamic down and to allow yourself. I think it takes a sort of particular mindset to be able to walk into that room and feel like that there is an equilibrium there.
It goes back to this idea of why, that on a pure psychological level, why are we choosing to see the people in the room, the panel, as the people that are going to meet your need? Okay. So not necessarily because they're powerful, that doesn't meet a need, but you want something from them. And the problem is we forget what they could give to you in terms of, you know, it's a two-way street. But we often, and as a designer also pitching for jobs, same thing, I'd go in and pitch a job, but also I'd run the job, always being subservient to showrunners and execs, and that is what leaves you wide open for bullying and harassment, and poor behaviour, because you just will take it. So I took two years leaving the industry and unpicking all of that to go, but why did I not give them the power? Why did I think that they were going to meet my need? I had totally got lost in that cycle of, I will only be feeling stable and secure as a person if I have money coming in. So getting a job and putting up with behaviour will satisfy that fundamental need I have for being safe. But what happened after sort of, 20 odd years doing this, I didn't realise that the work environment I was in and the people, sadly in some of the jobs that I were doing, the very unsafe space that I was in, psychologically very unsafe working environments with some really awful people, were actually doing the very opposite of undermining my sense of safety. But in my head, I conditioned myself going, but I'll be safe as long as I keep getting a job, and I must do really well, and I must be subservient, and I must say yes, 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 and make it amazing. And I must be an excellent designer and must do that until the bubble bursts, really, until you burn out and go, that was a kind of entirely misplaced need. So I had sort of put all this need on these powerful people that could meet my need, but actually they were the very people making it unsafe. And it took me a long process to understand that. And I would hope in all the work that I do, I can help people maybe be aware of that a little bit sooner in their careers, that these people, when you go into that room, why do you think they have the power? Is it because this job is going to deliver a fundamental need you think you have? Are you going to feel like, if I get this job, rent's going to be paid? So therefore, those people in the room are kind of the gatekeepers to my rent being paid. So therefore, I give them that power. And to kind of question and challenge how much power those people really, or how much power this job potential role has in satisfying some other big things in your need to make you feel safe and secure. And it's unpicking that as opposed to just being confident walking into the room. I think that's just a mask for actually how else you could relate to that. And mine was a slow burn over 20 years. Yeah. And I totally took the eye off the ball as to how bad people were being. And if you are neurodiverse as well and susceptible to sort of being quite naive in situations, people will totally take advantage of that, and always then know how to keep you in your slightly submissive place and remind you who's in charge. And then we'd start listening to that messaging of, you know, don't be so sensitive or be tough. You know, for me, a gendered conversation was, you know, you gotta, you know,
man up.
That was said to me on a really big American TV show.
Really?
Oh my God.
Which I won't say who it was, but I was working 18 hours a day, and that is not enough. And if you're not tough enough and man enough to do this, then we'll get someone else who will. And that's a head of department on a major US UK TV show. But that's still the same messaging. And I still felt that person had all the power to say that. And it's taken me 2 years to unpick that and question why I continue to feed into that. Why I stayed 4 months too long on that gig already. And why I didn't leave sooner. Because I just felt like they had all the power. So.
And I think that's really useful as well, for the fact that, you know, the Actors Benevolent Fund includes stage managers as well. And although they're not auditioning, they're in a similar situation to the one you would have been in, and in that same power dynamic as well. And it's just so important to remember all of that, and the way that people are speaking to you and how much power you can give them inadvertently to do it. Which brings me to the final question to you both about reviews. How good are you at dealing with reviews, Omari? Your face.
It's we'll call it work in progress.
Okay, good.
No, I guess I try and have more of a healthy one. I wish I had a healthier relationship with it, in the sense that, like what you were saying about kind of social media and stuff. It's like you can't. There's a world where, I mean, obviously you can turn those apps off and stuff, but it's like you go on there and it's just there in front of you. Particularly if you're in a show that is particularly popular or very present or on everyone's radar, like it is just there. And also you find that people just take it upon themselves to, and obviously this is what social media is, but people will just like comment, like say for example on Instagram, they'll just comment on your posts and stuff, maybe stuff that's unrelated, and they'll say, I saw the show, but again, like what you were talking about, like with needs, and like it's like when I have found myself sort of like looking at a review or something, it's like I wish I could ask myself more, like, what am I trying to get from this? And I guess a lot of it is just validation about your own creative self. Which is mad. And like, I mean, they're everywhere. And I mean, very often, like you do shows and the marketing will change, like once reviews comes out, and you sort of then have poster boards outside the theatre that have quotes in them. And so it's just there for you to see. And in a way, there's a kind of an element of like not actually being able to get away from it. When I was cast in Constellations a couple of years ago, and obviously because it was the first time that they'd sort of kind of queered that particular story, it like got picked up in a lot of gay media and stuff. And I remember there was like, maybe it was like Attitude or Gay Times or something. I remember being tagged in something on Instagram, and it was as they'd sort of done the press sort of announcing the multiple cast for the show. And I remember just looking at it, and one of the first things that I saw was someone saying, you know, and obviously Russell Tovey has like a huge fan base, and someone basically commented being like, oh, I wish they'd paired him up with someone who was better looking. And I was just like, I was like, great. I was like, good start. God. And so, I mean, as the solution is for a lot of people, I have so many friends who choose not to have social media, and like, you know, that is a solution. You know, that and it is quite a simple solution, to be fair. But then at the same time, it kind of becomes difficult because as we've all learned over the past few years, it's suddenly become this kind of like tool for like work promotion and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's again just a weird spiral. I mean,
it's just to close off, do you have any thoughts around just dealing with reviews and, you know, how much you care about what total strangers think about?
Well, it's obviously I've never had. I mean, as a designer, obviously, I think I've had stuff, you know, in reviews, but it's never been part of something I've had to think about and worry about. It's never a reflection on whether I will get another job or not.
Sure.
That's not how it's worked. But in now stepping back and doing well-being and mental health and supporting. Coaching and looking at people, yes, of course, you mentioned it's that need for validation. Okay, that's another conversation to have. But I think I'm also an artist. I'm a practicing artist, and I always have been, I think, and I have this constant struggle with what people will think of my work, and and it's not the same as being an actor, but it is still that manifestation of I'm putting something out there, and it is really crippling, the self-doubt. And what I learned, I think, from being a designer for so many years, and I'm actually weirdly grateful I didn't train to be an artist and instead followed being a designer. What it teaches you that it's all process. So I have learned to sit in the process. I really genuinely actually don't care what the end result is. And I think there's some really smart artists and designers and creatives that the end product will be what it is. Yeah. My question is, did you enjoy and did you feel that there was integrity in the process and the method in which you got there? Yeah. And as a designer, it is all method and process. Rather than the end result. As a designer, when you're building sets and you're creating, you know, film locations or building sets on stage or on screen, mine's just one bit of the work. Then it will be handed on, then it'll be lit, and then it'll be performed, and then it'll be edited and graded and all sorts of stuff. It's never mine. Yeah. So in a way, I had to then learn to be a designer to be creatively satisfied with the process. Now I know that can't necessarily be true for the actor's process. I think it can. But I think it's to learn to focus on. And I used to get hired for jobs. I didn't have a portfolio for the last 10 years. They want to know, how do you work? So I learned to get really good at pitching how I work, my process and my method. It's like, this is how I work. You're either going to like it or you're not. So we're either going to work or we're not. Yeah. And I learned to focus so much more on your process and your method. Do you enjoy that? Can you get some satisfaction from that? And to relinquish the control in the end result. So if you have made something, it's a press night, or I've made a sculpture, or I've made a painting, or whatever it is the review of that final object as important or more important than your whole process and your sort of period of your method putting it together, and learning to refocus yourself. You're absolutely right. I think you should shut the door on a weaponized world of social media and reviews, because I'm not sure how helpful that is in progressing your method and your process for the next job. Because it's done. It's you finished it. And that's not the thing that's going to make you want to make more work, whether you want to perform or you want to create. So focus more on the process and the method in order to nourish you. And that end result will just be what it'll be. What it is. You know? And in some way you can't really help it. And honestly, if it was perfect, we'd all just stop what we were doing and do something else. The whole point is it's not quite there. That's why we are driven to go, let's do it again. Let's see if I can do this better, or explore that more, or just test myself a little bit more in this area. I think that's what drives us as creatives. So perhaps we should focus on the need to keep that momentum rather than getting the validation at, you know, like a full stop at the end of each project. That's my thought.
That's a great way to end. I love it. I think that's great. Focus on the process. And I think it's 100% applicable to actors. And thank you so much, both Omari and Lisa. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you too. You too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the ABF podcast. If you've been affected by any of the issues raised in this episode, you can find helpful links in the show notes. If you would like to become a member of the ABF, support us, or require support, you can find everything you need on our website, details of which are also in the show notes. Until next time, goodbye.